Okay, welcome. Good evening. Welcome to our online session titled What Does Judaism Have to Do with Gnosticism? Organized by KADIT, the School of Comparative History of Religions. We have a very special guest today, Professor Charles Häberl. Thank you, Professor, for being with us today. It is a pleasure to have you with us. And Professor Charles Häberl is a faculty member of Rutgers University, and his research focuses on the Semitic languages and the late antiquity and the Mandaean tradition. And we are very pleased to have you, Professor. Thank you again. And before we begin, a brief introduction about KADIT. KADIT, some of you already know, KADIT is an independent research school focusing on the history of religions and organizing weekly and monthly programs, inviting experts and academics from around the world. And you can find out more about KADIT through our X page. And our seminars are open to everyone. You can join, you can be a KADIT researcher or participant. And today we have a very special topic, as I said. And in the first part, we'll have Professor's presentation. And at the end, we have a short Q&A session. Thank you again. Professor, floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for hosting me here today. I was really looking forward to this. I am going to give you a slideshow. I hope that the internet gods favor me. If there's any problems, please let me know. I will begin by sharing the screen, so just be aware of that. And it's going to do here, my window. Where is my, just one second. There we go. Oh, here we are. So I'm going to start my slideshow. Okay, well, thank you again for inviting me here. Scholars such as us often struggle with what I like to call the perverse resistance of their subjects in the real world to easy classification. Today, I'd like to explore with you the fuzzy edges of Judaism and Gnosticism to test their true boundaries. And I'll be using an ablative approach focused on one such community, the Mandaeans of Iraq and Iran. And I'll show how this somewhat marginal Gnostic group can help us better understand and perhaps redefine the broader category. I'll argue that Gnosticism is defined less by traditional criteria, such as antinomianism, or, some might say an acute Hellenization of Christianity, and more by a shared biblical thought world and a deeply allegorical approach to interpretation, which is influenced by Greek thought, among others. But first, let me share a few words with you about academic categories. Now, categories are easy to construct, but they're more difficult to define. It is easy to use them as kinds of boxes into which we sort entities in the real world, or perhaps umbrellas under which we vainly strive to cover them in all their manifold expressions. But real-world entities like Jews and Gnostics and so on, they often resist the peculiarly academic impulse to taxonomize everything. And instead, they subject us to a kind of Wittgensteinian language game. Now, confronted with this perverse resistance, many scholars, particularly those of a more deconstructivist bent, absolutely reject these categories as artificial and unrepresentative, and they often summon new ones into being to serve in the task of holding and sorting the very same entities, only to discover that the old categories are load-bearing. That is to say, they still perform useful tasks for all of us, and for this reason, they are not so easily displaced without causing the entire scholarly edifice to come collapsing down. So, We must first start by asking ourselves whether categories such as Judaism and Gnosticism are still useful to us, insofar as they continue to do useful work for us, and if so, whether they are indeed worth refining and thereby redeeming. Okay. Let's go. Not good. Give me 1 second. I will start sharing again. Okay. Okay, perfect. This sort of conceptual engineering is easier said than done. Our first problem is that our inherited categories are often prototypical. Now, what I mean by that is if I ask you to picture a bird in your mind, for example, most of you will immediately imagine something like a sparrow rather than an ostrich, for example. Similarly, if I ask you to picture something like, this is going to be a huge problem. Let's go. Similarly, if I ask you to picture something like a Jew in your mind, right, you will probably think of an observant Jewish man with a long beard and a hat, perhaps wearing a parasol or engaged in prayer, something like the fellows in these pictures, this man and this woman. These prototypes are often where scholars look first when refining the parameters of a category, when they should, in fact, move beyond these examples to focus on those at the messy, fuzzy edges where the category begins to break down, if only because the reality is more complex than such easy attempts at categorization allow. For this reason, our focus should be on the suspected boundaries of the category rather than being diffused across the whole group of entities that it putatively comprises, where we risk losing sight of the problem. Now, returning again to Wittgenstein, we should avoid all or nothing verdicts concerning membership in a category, instead considering it as a matter of probability, a series of family resemblances extending into the boundaries of the category and perhaps even beyond. So we should consider marginal examples of birds and Jews rather than prototypical ones to get the true boundaries of the category. In addition to the prototypical Orthodox Ashkenazim and Sephardim who characterize the Jews in the West, there are also members of the category who are, for lack of a better word, more marginal. These might include the Beta Israel in Ethiopia, who observe a pre-rabbinic and therefore non-Talmudic form of Judaism called Hemanot, and they have their own biblical literature written in a classical Ethio-Semitic language, Ge'ez, rather than Hebrew, which overlaps considerably with the scriptures of other Jews, but it's not entirely coterminous. It includes many books that other Jews consider apocryphal and find no place in the mainstream canon of the bulk of the world's Jewry. Some of them have even converted to Christianity, although these last were granted full rights and privileges in the state of Israel, including the right of return, provided that they began to practice mainstream Orthodox rabbinic Judaism upon their arrival in Israel. Finally, from a phenotypical perspective, they are markedly different from other Jews with which you may be familiar, having darker skin and hair, as the photo illustrates, and they resemble their Christian and Muslim neighbors in the Horn of Africa more than their co-religionists in the rest of the world. A similar group is the Karailar, or Karaim, who are found in the Crimea and in other parts of Eastern Europe. And members of this community also enjoy the right of return under both Israeli and Jewish law, a fact recognized by the chief rabbinate of Israel. Although they traditionally speak a now severely endangered Turkic language, they are genetically related to other Ashkenazi Jews in Europe, and they preserve the very same set of scriptures as other European Jews, which they read in Hebrew. Much like the Beta Israel, however, they are non-rabbinic, and therefore they reject the traditional body of traditional biblical interpretation and jurisprudence instantiated in the Talmud, unlike the vast bulk of the world's Jews. Furthermore, many members of this community do not consider themselves to be ethnically Jewish, but rather descended from other peoples, including a now vanished Turkic empire, perhaps due to their unique historical experience, particularly with anti-Semitism, with Nazism, with the communists. Even so, their inclusion within the category of Jews is uncontroversial. From these two cases, we may assume that neither race nor ethnicity is a sufficient criterion for inclusion in the category of Jews, right? We have Black Jews, we have Turkish Jews. Additionally, we may assume that one need not live according to rabbinic strictures or endorse traditional rabbinic interpretations of the Bible in order to be a Jew, since neither of these two communities do these things, nor do secular Jews for that matter, but their status as Jews is indisputable. Finally, the Beta Israel demonstrate that there is no fixed biblical canon in any language that serves as a criterion for membership in the category of Jews, as they have their own set of books in their own language that only partially overlap with those of the Jewish mainstream. Another way to go about this is what I call an ablative approach. Now, this entails considering what individual features might make or break the definition of membership within the category, in this case of Judaism, and see what happens when you take them away. For example, does membership in the category Jew require faith in God? Or, for that matter, is Judaism conferred exclusively by matrilineal descent? Or do proselytes, converts, and the children of mixed couples also belong to the category of Jews? Some people will, in fact, define Judaism in a way that admits atheists and converts. Others will not. But I maintain that these definitions often tell us more about the people making them than they do about the categories themselves or the members of these categories. And this is as true for insiders, such as the Big O Orthodox Jews in the leftmost picture, as it is for outsiders, such as historians of religion like yourselves. That being said, the perennial and visible existence of converts to Judaism, and also Jews that don't believe in God and Jews who have converted from Judaism to other religions, all of them pose material threats to the purity of this category, defined as it is by prototypical examples, and I hope they demonstrate the limitations of such categories. In this regard, the Samaritans are especially useful. This community lives today almost exclusively in the land of Israel, and many of them are citizens of the state of Israel, where they enjoy the same rights and privileges as their Jewish neighbors. Much like the Beta Israel, they revere many of the same sacred texts as the Jewish mainstream, albeit not all of them, in their own form of Hebrew, written in their own unique script alongside their own works, much like the Beta Israel again. And they also reject the Talmud and the Jewish mainstream body of interpretation and jurisprudence that it represents. Furthermore, much like the Karailar or the Karaim, they are closely related to Jews, even if they themselves do not identify as such, right? They identify themselves as ethnically something else. So, why do we not consider Samaritans to be Jews? It would appear that the primary reason for their separation is not geographic or linguistic or literary, but rather both Samaritans and Jews mutually agree in their non-membership in the same category, right? They both say we're not Jews. Samaritans aren't Jews. Both Samaritans and Jews can agree upon this. If we were to take away this mutual assent of non-membership, then we would be hard-pressed not to consider Samaritans members of the same categories as Jews, as we do Karaim and Beta Israel. For similar reasons, we don't consider Christians to be Jews, notwithstanding all these other similarities and these objections. Although lately Jews and Christians have invented new categories, such as Judeo-Christian civilization, as a basis for collaboration on shared projects, and even Abrahamic religions as a basis for collaboration on shared projects with their Muslim neighbors. Finally, any criterion for membership in a category should be falsifiable, which is to say specific enough that a test case could prove them wrong. Essentials criteria, or those based upon inner states, such as sincerity, are very good examples of this. We could very well imagine a person who claims to be Muslim but openly violates every Muslim moral code, fails to engage in the religious life of Muslims by praying, fasting, attending services, and so on, and even publicly contradicts widely held Muslim beliefs. In arguing such a person's membership in the category of Muslims, one person might argue that even a bad Muslim is still a Muslim, but another might argue that such a person's claims about being Muslim are demonstrably insincere through their actions. I submit that both arguments are unsatisfying, not only because they can't be proven wrong, but also both of these observers are moving the boundaries of the category to accommodate their own biases in a manner akin to the no true Scotsman fallacy, if you're familiar with that. You can easily imagine someone saying, he can't be Muslim because I saw him drinking and no true Muslim would ever drink. But the logical conclusion of such an observation would be that we can never truly know how many Muslims there are in the world. Okay, let's try this again. Wonderful. Now, how does this all relate to the question of Gnosticism? For starters, you've already heard from a number of leading historians of religion, and most of them are working from different definitions of this phenomenon. And that's just historians of religion. Because the phenomenon of Gnosticism has implications for scholars working across a variety of fields, including, but not limited to, anthropologists, historians, literary theorists, philologists, philosophers, political scientists, psychologists, and theologians, scholars of all sorts have attempted to grapple with this phenomenon with varying approaches and varying degrees of success. The sheer diversity of our definitions demonstrates both the instability of this term and its utility for scholars working across multiple frameworks. Let me start with some of our earliest witnesses to the phenomenon, who all happen to be early church fathers, writing accounts of what they describe as the top heresies of their time. So this includes, for example, Irenaeus, right? Irenaeus described it as a generic label for heretics who capitalize on gnosis for salvation. And it's characterized by secret traditions and distorted scriptures. But on the other hand, we have his contemporary Clement of Alexandria, right? Who co-opts Gnosticism. You know, he has his own definition of what true Gnostics are and what fake ones are. The fake ones are not the ones who are Christian like him. And he defines gnosis, in his opinion, right, this esoteric knowledge of the Gnostics, is what makes us free is the knowledge of who we were and what we became, where we were and what we were thrown into, where to we hasten and whence we are redeemed, what birth is and what rebirth is. And the interesting thing about this quote from Clement of Alexandria is that this could easily describe mainstream Christian thought. It's definitely a Gnostic idea. We find it also in Platonism too. So he is kind of an interstitial character. He's one of the people who test the boundary of this category. And then finally, a little later in the 4th century, we have a fellow named Epiphanius of Salamis, and he, on the other hand, defined it as a kind of diverse collection of dangerous heresies. He actually calls it a many-headed hydra that has corrupted true Christianity by mixing it with pagan mythology and philosophy. Now, what can we discard from these definitions? Well, obviously, there are non-specific, non-falsifiable aspects of these definitions, these criteria, such as the polemical language like heretical and distorted, or describing it as a many-headed hydra. These things just broadcast their own subjective positions. But there's a lot that we could keep from the way that these theologians have described Gnosticism, and indeed their definitions define the field up until the middle of the 19th century. Now, a partial list might include something like cosmic dualism, not only between good and evil, light and darkness, things like that, but also a lesser creator and an alien, ineffable, transcendent God, the foreign origins of the soul and its transmigration without a resurrection, unlike normative Christians, right? They believe that the material world will perish and we'll all be rejoined in a more perfect, ideal world. Elite knowledge or gnosis, a rejection of contemporary morals reflected either by extreme asceticism or libertinism, right? They just reject the morals of this world and they engage in all kinds of weird behaviors. And seemingly, it would appear, Gnosticism's relationship with Christianity mixed along with other things. And this is prototypical Gnosticism in a nutshell, of the sort that encyclopedists like for example, the Catholic Encyclopedia of 1910, right, which defined it as a collective name for a large number of greatly varying and pantheistic idealistic sects characterized by an utter pessimism towards the universe. Or for that matter, Baker's Evangelical Dictionary and the first edition from 1986, it described it as an incipient sort of heresy addressed by Paul in his epistle to the Colossians, which is based upon philosophical premises of ethnic and religious superiority and secret knowledge. These are polemical definitions, right? They are informed by the polemics of earlier generations of theologians. And, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you went looking for a definition of Gnosticism, this is what you would find in such sources. Now, although these views of the category persisted for centuries, scholarship on the subject eventually moved on, right, especially after the discovery of new manuscripts, which were produced by the adherents of some of the sects against which these early church fathers invade. And it attempted to abandon the original polemical framework that I've just described and resituate the Gnostics in their original historical and geographical context. Now, one such figure was Adolf von Harnack, whom you've heard about before, undoubtedly. He described it famously as the acute Hellenization of Christianity, whereby Christian faith was transformed into a mythological philosophy. Now, by contrast, Richard Reitzenstein described it as a distinct pre-Christian religious phenomenon rooted in Iranian and Mesopotamian syncretism. Now, Reitzenstein must be known to, along with other figures such as Wilhelm Busse, and the members of the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule, or the History of Religion School. They all proposed that Gnosticism was a phenomenon that predated and in fact influenced Christianity. And this intervention marked a critical turn from Christian and Hellenistic texts to Eastern Iranian texts, especially those of religions like Manichaeism and Mandaism, which the History of Religion School assigned to a separate Eastern branch of Gnosticism in contrast to the Western Hellenistic branch. And of course, this is all familiar to you from Professor Shinasi Gündüz's presentation a few weeks ago. Now, finally, I can't talk about the school without mentioning, of course, Kurt Rudolph. He's the most recent of these figures. He described it as a religious tradition that emphasized the primary importance of gnosis, or a mystical knowledge. Now, Rudolph is significant for producing an extensive body of work on Mandaism, to which I shall later return, because Mandaeans are both a living Gnostic tradition, but also one of the marginal cases that allow us to test the boundaries of this category. Now, these scholars, and there are others I could mention, but in the interest of time, I shall not, were consummate philologians and historians of religion, and they brought their disciplinary strengths and perspectives to the study of Gnosticism, seeking to understand it rationally, unencumbered by the sectarian polemics of previous generations. Due to his long career, Kurt Rudolph serves as a kind of bridge between this generation of scholars and subsequent ones who introduced what might be termed a kind of psychoanalytical approach to Gnosticism and ultimately attempted to decontextualize it from its historical and geographical origins. The primary concern of the previous generation, which is to say whether it was of Eastern or Western origin, whether it was Hellenistic or Iranian, and what its relationship to Christianity and other religions, including Judaism, was. So of this, of course, are figures like Carl Jung, right? Jung described it as a product of cultural assimilation, is therefore of the greatest interest in elucidating and defining the contents constellated by prophecies about the Redeemer, or his appearance in history, or by the synchronicity of the archetype, right? This is this Jungian archetype. Similarly, his contemporary, your contemporary, Hans Jonas, also applied a psychoanalytical approach to the phenomenon of Gnosticism, and he described it as an existential experience of human alienation, characterized by a dualistic mood and world abnegation, right? For these two figures, Gnosticism was not necessarily strictly a historical and geographical phenomenon, but rather a possibility inherent within any religious tradition. And I need to mention, in connection with these other two scholars, but somewhat different from them, also another figure who must be known to you, Mircea Eliade. Eliade described Gnosticism as a broad variety of religious teachings offering knowledge of the otherwise hidden truth as the indispensable key to man's salvation, right? Not just something Christian, not just something Iranian, but a possibility inherent in a lot of religions. Now, these three scholars and others like them were deeply influential in moving the study of Gnosticism out of the exclusive province of a few historians of religion and philologists and making it relevant to other disciplines. But ironically, by unmooring Gnosticism from its original historical and geographic context, they and others like them paved the way for its resuscitation as a polemical term. So among these figures is the political theorist Eric Voegelin, right, who wrote quite a lot about Gnosticism. He described it as the experience of the world as an alien place into which man is strayed and from which it must find its way back home to the other world of his origin. And for him, the Gnostic movements of antiquity were the direct antecedents of the secular totalitarian movements of the 20th century, such as National Socialism and communism, with their emphasis on what he described as immanentizing the eschaton, or remaking the fallen world according to its utopian form. Not from a religious perspective, but rather from a secular perspective. And another figure like this, of course, is Harold Bloom, right? Harold Bloom is a literary scholar. He described Gnosticism as a knowing by and of an uncreated self, or self within the self, and the knowledge that leads to freedom, a dangerous and doom-eager freedom from nature, time, history, community, other selves. For him, small g Gnosticism was a vital mode of solitary, imaginative spirituality, focusing upon an internal divine spark, self-reliance, and a direct private experience of God, unencumbered by dogma. Now, in a series of books, Harold Bloom argued that this Gnosticism was the true American religion, capital A, capital R, whether Americans of all creeds recognize this or not. Now, to scholars such as these working within the rubric of religious studies, this was a ridiculous expansion of the category, and predictably it provoked a backlash. So Michael Williams, who's pictured here in his 1996 book, Rethinking Gnosticism, describes as a dubious category lacking any ancient self-definition or any consistent set of shared beliefs. And he suggests scrapping the category and replacing it with a new one of biblical demiurgical traditions as more accurate. For that matter, Karen King, also one of his contemporaries, right, and another leading deconstructionist theorist, called Gnosticism as a modern reification and a terminological construct, something artificial used as a rhetorical tool purely for identity formation. And then finally, David Bracca, right, from Ohio State, come on. There we go. He described it as an ancient Christian movement or school of thought which addressed basic human concerns about alienation and meaning, offering a message of salvation in Jesus and providing a way for people to regain knowledge of God, the ultimate source of their being, by actively participating in an ongoing reinvention of Christianity. So basically, they tried to scrap this category and try and apply it in a different way for all of their, for a different audience of religious studies scholars. Now, what we see in the past 3 decades of scholarship on Gnosticism is not merely a rejection of the category, but also an attempt to recenter research into the phenomenon on what I earlier described as prototypical Gnosticism. In my humble opinion, this effort is both misguided and hopeless, right? Misguided because no scholar of religion would ever argue that we need to deconstruct similarly inherited categories such as Judaism or Christianity by recentering them upon prototypical Jews or prototypical Christians. And it's hopeless in light of the fact that it continues to do a lot of useful work for scholars across different fields. And scholars of religion don't have a monopoly on how anthropologists, historians, literary scholars, and the like employ this term. Therefore, we return to my original concern, which is how we can redeem this much maligned and misunderstood category in an objective manner, using some of the tools that I described earlier, such as focusing on the margins of the category and applying an ablative approach to see what makes the category and what breaks it. I do feel that there's value in returning to its original historical and geographic context, and that means coming to terms with the theme of my lecture, namely, what does Judaism have to do with Gnosticism? The relationship between these two categories has been a perennial concern, not only for scholars, both ancient and modern, of Gnosticism, but also the various communities deemed Gnostic themselves. Furthermore, the existence of Christian and Jewish Gnostics, or at least individual members of these communities who appear to hold Gnostic beliefs, notwithstanding their rejection by the Jewish and Christian mainstream, presents a problem for anyone who wishes to distinguish and disambiguate these 3 phenomena: Gnosticism, Christianity, and Judaism. So I have one last card to play for all of you here. Let us turn now to one such individual who tests the boundaries of what it is to be a Jew, while at the same time is conventionally recognized as one. Philo of Alexandria, who lived around the turn of the Common Era and therefore predates the historical emergence of both Christianity and Gnosticism. Now, Philo is noteworthy as having been perhaps the first Jewish thinker to apply an allegorical interpretation of the Torah, primarily the books of Genesis and Exodus, which would later occupy the attention of Gnostics and Christians alike, situating them firmly within the Hellenistic philosophical currents of his time. For this reason, he is often described as both a Middle Platonist and a Jew. And while some of his observations influenced his fellow co-religionists, other Jews, who later elaborated them in the doctrines of the divine word, which created the world, the divine throne chariot and its cherub, the divine splendor and the Shekinah, the name of God, as well as the names of the angels. But his greatest influence, I'd argue, lies in the extent to which his approach to the exegesis of biblical texts rather directly inspired Christian theologians, who cited him quite approvingly, and somewhat less transparently inspired Gnostics as well. Some of the other aspects of his theology, which is by no means systematic, but rather contextual and at times seemingly contradictory, include his belief in a transcendent and ineffable God, and a second God, the firstborn son of this ineffable one, whom he described in Middle Platonist terms as the Logos, or Word of God, and a similarly bifurcated creation of man, both heavenly and earthly. For Philo, the material body of the earthly man provided an impediment to its soul's contemplation of the transcendent God, and therefore salvation consisted of the soul's recognition of its heavenly origins and its ascent back to them. Now, some of these aspects later became part and parcel of mainstream Christian doctrine, for which reason the early church fathers rather liked Philo, and similarly, they became characteristic of the Gnostic communities that later emerged in the same general region. And while we cannot prove a causal relationship at the very least, these similarities provide us with an opportunity to test the boundaries of these categories, which is my aim all along. Let's return now to the ablative process that I described earlier. What can we take away without breaking the category and making Gnostics simply Jews or Christians, albeit unconventional ones? It was fashionable for a time after Harnack to describe Gnosticism as the acute Hellenization of Christianity, even to the point where it became radically anti-Jewish, to a greater degree than mainstream Christianity, which was plenty anti-Jewish to begin with. The prototypical Christian Gnostic in this sense is probably Marcion of Sinope, who lived around the middle of the 2nd century, and as you probably know, distinguished the one true God from the vengeful demiurge of the Hebrew Bible, and proclaimed Jesus Christ to be the son of this one true God and not what he called the demiurge. Intriguingly, Marcion was the first Christian to propose a canon, which consisted of 10 Pauline epistles and his own gospel, but he rejected the rest of the books considered for canonical for Jews, or for that matter, most other Christians. Thus, we can certainly conceive of Gnostics who have rejected most or all of the texts that compose the Bible, but who still preserve a biblical worldview and a sacred literature informed by it. That evidently does not break the category, since Marcion is still uncontroversially considered to be a Gnostic, even if some scholars, such as Bart Ehrman, contrast his faith with what I called prototypical Gnosticism earlier, and they find it lacking. That said, even if we conceive of a Gnosticism without the Bible, I still maintain that we would be hard-pressed to conceive of a Gnosticism not rooted in that biblical worldview, like Marcionism, with or without the biblical canon, if only because it would be indistinguishable from other esoteric mystical traditions. Now, that probably would break the category. That said, even those Gnostics who, unlike Marcion, do not reject the Hebrew Bible wholesale, nonetheless have a complicated relationship with Jews and Jewish law. Ever since the days of Irenaeus and Epiphanius, it has been conventional to describe most Gnostics as antinomian, insofar as they reject moral laws such as the Jewish halakha by grace of their secret knowledge. This has been another pillar of conventional descriptions of prototypical Gnosticism and sectarian polemics against Gnostics. But antinomianism is by no means restricted to Gnostics, nor, for that matter, are all Gnostic communities antinomian. This brings me back to the special case of the Mandaeans, who are the primary focus of the scholar, Kurt Rudolph, in whom I have also made the focus of my own career. Now, in his book, Gnostic Ethics and Mandaean Origins, the Rutgers scholar Edwin Yamauchi distinguishes Mandaeans from other Gnostic groups precisely on this one point. Because Mandaeans pointedly reject asceticism, they embrace marriage, but they are deeply concerned with ritual purity, like Jews, like Muslims, and other communities, to a much greater extent than, for example, Christians. For Yamauchi, just as Reichenstein, Mandaeism was ultimately of Eastern, in his opinion, probably Babylonian origins, but in Yamauchi's opinion, it was a marriage of Gnostic cosmogonic theology and non-Gnostic ethics. In the time remaining, I would like to examine some Mandaean texts more closely to ascertain whether these assertions hold up by considering the origins of that theology and those ethics. First, I'd like to bracket the important but relatively well-researched question of Mandaean cosmogony. You can read Edwin Yamauchi's book for that. You find something quite like it already in Philo, and if you read the cosmogonic sections of the chief Mandaean scripture, the Ginza, you will find an allegorical approach to the very same Hebrew text that so occupied Philo of Alexandria, namely Genesis and Exodus, albeit with a Mandaean flavor. And you can do that by consulting my latest monograph, The Book of Kings and Explanations of This World, in which I outline the specific ways in which Mandaeans read the same narrative, also found in the Hebrew Bible, in direct dialogue with that text. Let us, however, consider the origin of their ethics, which have so long been described as a rejection of Judaism, starting with the first book of the Ginza Rabbah. In this text, which is paralleled elsewhere in the Ginza Rabbah, we find all the hallmarks of a rejection of the Jewish God, who is here described explicitly with the Hebrew word Adonai, which means my Lord in Hebrew, along with several other Hebrew names. At first, this would appear to be our first point of disagreement with Philo, insofar as for Mandaeans, their transcendent and ineffable God is not his transcendent or ineffable God. It is, however, also a point of disagreement with other so-called Gnostic traditions in that Mandaeans do not identify the Jewish God Adonai as the demiurge or creator of the material world. Instead, for them, the material world is created through the agency of the emanations of that same transcendent and ineffable God, exactly as in Philo's scheme, even if Mandaeans would disagree with him on the precise name of that God. We also see an express rejection of circumcision, which aligns Mandaeans with the more antinomian Gnostics and, for that matter, most mainstream Christians. So far, so good. But what follows becomes weirder. Mandaeans accuse Jews of sprinkling blood on their face, homosexuality, and sexual contact with menstruating women, all of which are major sources of ritual impurity in Mandaeism, but also, for that matter, in Judaism. In the parallel passage from the next book, the sins of the Jews are outlined even further. Jews impurify their own temple with blood and animal sacrifice. They circumcise and they put the circumcision blood in their mouths. They perform more homosexual acts. In short, they deny the words of their own Lord and they turn away from their own faith, and they must therefore be avoided for their ritual impurity. Peculiarly, this Mandaean text explicitly accuses Jews of denying Moses and of corrupting the works of Abraham. Now, what's really fascinating about this is that these accusations actually find their analogs in Jewish law, even in the same section of the Torah, the book of Leviticus. The descriptions of Jewish ritual and impurity laws are so similar that it almost seems as if the author of these sections of the Ginza Rabbah was directly in dialogue with them. These include the concerns over menstruation, the use of animal blood and fat in the temple rituals, prohibitions against consuming blood, and against homosexual acts. If anything, the Mandaean approach to ritual purity is logically more consistent than the Jewish one. If blood is so polluting, why would you dash it against your altar? We find a similar approach to the question of circumcision. The Mandaean rejection of circumcision has long been understood as a rejection of Jewish law and an important signifier of Mandaean identity. However, this rejection is explicitly founded upon principles of bodily integrity, found also in the Torah. At several points in the Mandaean priestly handbook, the 1012 Questions, bodily integrity is established as a prerequisite for priesthood. This includes any blemishes or defects in the body, eye, hand, foot, or other limb, and expressly against anyone who has sinned against his body with an iron blade, which most scholars understand as being a reference to the circumcision ceremony. Such people may indeed continue to participate in Mandaean rituals as laity, but they cannot become priests. What is so remarkable about these conditions is that they mirror almost precisely the prerequisites for priesthood in Leviticus 21. Once again, anyone who is blemished or maimed in their sight or any of their limbs, including those expressly listed by the Mandaean sources, is ineligible for the Jewish priesthood, although he may nonetheless participate in Jewish rituals. Thus, once again, these specific Mandaean ritual and ethical concerns are not a rejection of Jewish ethics, but rather a response to what Mandaeans perceive as logical inconsistencies in Jewish practice. If priests need to be completely intact and without blemish, why do Jews cut off part of their own sexual organs? Furthermore, as Mark Lidzbarski, who was the pioneer translator of these texts, notes, the references to Jews taking the blood of the circumcision into their mouths describes precisely the ritual of Metzitza V'Peh, according to which the ritual circumciser, or moil, sucks the blood directly from the circumcision wound. Much like the application of blood to the altar, this practice strikes Mandaeans as deeply impurifying. Why, if blood is impurifying, would priests suck it into their mouths? It makes no sense to Mandaeans, and that is why they reject it. Now, I cannot emphasize enough that this is not the antinomianism and radical anti-Judaism of other Gnostic groups, or for that matter, Christians, but something quite different. An appropriation and a logical perfection of Jewish law based upon a critical reading of a Jewish text. I see absolutely no Iranian or Babylonian influence here against Reichenstein, against Yamauchi, against a lot of other scholars. So therefore, no definition of Gnosticism that encompasses the sole surviving Gnostic community from late antiquity, the Mandaeans, can privilege these criteria because they break the category, both by aligning Gnostics with other non-Gnostic groups, like Christians, but by excluding cases like the Mandaeans, who test the very boundaries of this category explicitly for this reason, because of their difference from what we have come to consider prototypical Gnosticism. Now, I'd like to leave you here with a few conclusions. Inherited academic categories often rely upon prototypical examples which fail at the fuzzy edges where our reality is much more complex. Effective classification requires focusing on these boundaries and family resemblances rather than essentialist all-or-nothing verdicts. An ablative approach of the sort that I described to the category of Jews reveals that race, ethnicity, and adherence to rabbinic law are not strictly necessary for inclusion within that category, as evidenced by groups like the Beta Israel and the Karailar of Crimea. Conventional definitions often label Gnostics as antinomian or anti-Jewish. However, Mandaean ethics actually represent a logical perfection of Jewish purity laws, such as those regarding circumcision and priesthood, rather than a wholesale rejection of them. Gnosticism is best defined as a discrete group of communities united by an expanded universe, right, the biblical one, and a specific allegorical hermeneutic applied to Hebrew sacred literature. Whether they have accepted this literature canonically or not, rather than by a specific canon or a geographical origin. The theological roots of Gnosticism and of Christianity are deeply intertwined with the early allegorical interpretations of the Torah practiced by thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, who bridged Middle Platonism and traditional Jewish biblical exegesis. And then finally, and this is my most important point, the survival of Mandaeans and of Mandaean literature provides us with a vital anecdote to the urge to retrospectively project modern religious identities onto the fluid, protean intellectual ferment of the Hellenistic East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. It was a very good presentation. And we have a short Q&A session now. Anyone wants to ask a question, anyone has a question, you can put or click the hand button. Can you see the hand button at the bottom of line? Okay, we have a question from chat. Professor, can you read, or I can read for you if you want?
Okay, I'm reading it right now. Actually, I'll read it for benefit of the other viewers who may not have it. Regarding my point on Mandaean ethics as a logical perfection of Jewish purity laws rather than a rejection of them, if we consider Gnosticism through this expanded universe and allegorical hermeneutics, would it then be fair to say that the Gnostic revolt was not against the Torah itself, but rather against a specific literalist interpretation of it that failed to meet the intellectual ferment of the Hellenistic East? That's, I think, very well put. I would argue that yes, but I would qualify it, of course. Namely, I'm weary of producing a kind of an invidious dyad here between literalism and allegorical interpretations, because I find that we do find allegorical interpreters like Philo sometimes being literal when it's convenient for him. And literalism, in my opinion, is just another mode of interpretation. So much like these other categories, which are very useful, it's very useful for me to talk about things as being allegorical. I just did. It's very useful for me to talk about things being literal. I don't mean to dismantle or just get rid of those, deconstruct those categories. But I will say that this is the nexus at which a lot of the tension between these communities occur. And it is also, quite pointedly, how a lot of early Christians who are engaged in this project of defining themselves against Gnosticism, how they fault Gnostics, right? Now, This is one area where I think my thinking converges with one of the scholars that I mentioned earlier, David Bracke. He described Gnostics as being almost like interactive partners in the construction of an early Christian identity, insofar as mainstream Christianity was not an outright rejection of Gnosticism, but a response to it, which produced what we consider today to be Christianity, right? Through this sort of like iterative back and forth dialogue with these texts that we find. And that is why when you look at some of the things that we consider to be inherently Gnostic, we find a lot that actually sounds quite familiar, right? Logos theology, the Son of God, all of this stuff, you know, it's familiar from Christianity. So I would agree with him on that. So yes, in short, I would agree with your observation, but I would qualify it just slightly. I see we have another question from Eva Cardelen. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. First of all, thank you for your presentation and the time you dedicated to us. My question is, according to you, what are the differences and similarities between Mandaism and Gnosticism? Thank you.
Well, that is really the heart of the question, isn't it? So I would say, as we are engaged now in the last 30 years, since, you know, Michael Williams published his book, Rethinking Gnosticism in 1996, I would say that we've all been struggling with this category. What is Gnosticism? We can define it very broadly, as some of my antecessors have, like antecedents like Hans Jonas and Eric Voegelin, such that it encompasses almost everything, right? You know, Nazis are Gnostic. For Harold Bloom, Americans are Gnostic. I mean, at that point, the category breaks down because it becomes meaningless. So can it be salvaged? Karen King, Michael Williams, and whatnot, the rest of them would say, no, it cannot be salvaged. I would say that goes too far. I don't know that new categories such as biblical demiurgical traditions are necessarily an improvement upon the old category of Gnosticism. And furthermore, I would say that Mandaeans, to get to the heart of your question, are essential for our understanding of Gnosticism, if only because they have curated what is effectively the largest and best understood and most well-preserved body of Gnostic texts, right? They're one of the only groups that identify explicitly as Gnostic, right? The word menda means knowledge, so it's exactly analogous to Gnostic, meaning agnostikos is one who possesses knowledge, and that is true for Mandaeans as well. And the only ones who are still around today, they have a continuous tradition since late antiquity, which has, of course, evolved in the manner of all traditions, all living traditions. So what are the main similarities and what are the main differences? I would say this brings me back to the whole question of Philo's intervention and his allegorical interpretation of scripture, right? All throughout the Mandaean corpus of literature, I find oblique and some not so oblique references to Jewish literature, including the Hebrew Bible. I also find rather interesting references to Iranian thought as well. And, you know, they're also in a dialogue with Jews, Christians, and Muslims at different points in history. So I would say in reframing this category of Gnosticism, it's really quite important to, first of all, not try and throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Any category of Gnosticism, any scholarly category of Gnosticism that defines a group like Mandaeans out of it is, in my opinion, a defective and unworkable category, right? At that point, how can, and you know, that goes in the opposite direction of defining Gnosticism too narrowly, where it no longer becomes useful for us. That's in contrast to the earlier approach in which everything is Gnosticism, right? Taoism is Gnosticism, Buddhists are Gnostic, right? The category becomes completely meaningless. And it's these differences, such as what I described earlier, for example, Mandaean ethics, which seem very similar, except in a few points where I think that they're calling out what they consider to be logical inconsistencies with Jewish ethics. This sets them apart from these other Gnostic groups, right? The Christian Gnostics, all of them are clearly not on board with Jewish law. Mandaeans, the case is a little more complicated. So I would say this means that antinomianism, right, it cannot be a fruitful criterion for what is or is not Gnosticism. Because if we say, oh, wait, Gnostics are antinomian, then that excludes a lot of people that we might consider to be Gnostic, like Jewish Gnostics, or for that matter, Mandaeans themselves. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, dear Professor.
Any questions? So we have another one. Esma, you can ask your question.
Okay, my question is, there's another ritualistic purity tradition in Judaism, which is men or Kohens are not allowed to go to cemetery or are not allowed to touch a dead person. Does this have a counterpart in Mandaeism or Gnosticism?
Yes, yeah, specifically in Mandaeism. One of the reasons why I find studying Mandaeism to be so fruitful is because we have a huge literature of priestly handbooks that says what priests can and cannot do, what they should do. It gives us some insight into the history of this institution, and it allows us to compare them with other religious leaders in the ancient world. We don't really have that from most other traditions. We can reconstruct to some extent stuff about for example, the Manichaean elite. The Manichaeans are a far more widely dispersed Gnostic community, according to most people. We have a huge literature for them, but this literature is often imperfectly understood. It's lacunos, it's full of holes. So I would say when it comes to Mandaean priests, which we know quite a lot about, they exist. You can visit them. They're all over the world. Some of them are even in Turkey. When it comes to Mandaean priests, they do avoid contact with dead bodies, except for, of course, the ritual of sealing a dead body after its death, before it goes on, before the soul of the dead person goes on to the Matrotha, into the worlds of light. And they do observe fastidious abstention from impurifying influences. These include blood. These include still water, right? They only drink running water. And they only wash their dishes and utensils in running water, and all kinds of meat, particularly meat that has not been slaughtered in a certain way, which is probably familiar to you from practices such as Jewish kashrut and also Muslim halal practices too. So in that sense, Mandaean priests look very much like the priests of other traditions. And I don't think that should surprise anyone.
Thanks.
Okay, is there any questions? Or we can close the session. Looks there's no question. Any other question? Professor, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. It was a pleasure to have you and KADIT with us tonight. And thank you everyone for being with us tonight and participating in the programs. We hope to see you in our future seminars also. Thank you and good evening. Professor, thank you again and good evening.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I really appreciate it. You know, please keep me updated. You can email me. I'm not a member of X, so I can't actually access your profile or see the links there. It's if you're not logged in, then you don't see these things. So, you know, let me know and I'll definitely attend. I'd be very
of course.
to do so. And I'd also like to follow your YouTube channel. I mean, that was how I got to see Professor Gündüz's lecture, even though I wasn't able to make it myself in person. You know, I'm quite impressed by what you've done here.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Have a great night.